"I do," he said. And Caroline, Mae Turner, swallowed the scream that bloomed in her throat like a wound. The chapel was too warm. That was her first coherent thought. Somewhere above the silk-covered hats and stiff collars, angels stared down from stained glass with indifferent eyes, bathed in morning light. The scent of roses clung thickly in the air, almost sickening now, as if the flowers knew what had just died in her chest. She had known, of course. She had known. But hearing him say it, watching James Everett Foster pledge his life to someone else, felt like being kissed and slapped in the same breath. Across the aisle, James lifted Margaret and Collins's hand to his lips, kissed her fingers like a knight from some tedious epic, and Caroline wanted to laugh, or sob, or set something on fire, preferably his cravat. But she didn't move. She sat perfectly still in the fourth pew, a red silk statue among women in dove gray and dusty blue. She had chosen this dress for a reason. Scarlet. No other color would do. It was not mourning. It was not approval. It was declaration. It was war. "Dearly beloved," the vicar had said, "we are gathered here today." Yes, Caroline thought, to bury the last foolish, hopeful part of me. There was clapping now, polite, anemic clapping, and smiles stretched over jaws too tight with curiosity. The audience, society's finest gossips and gentlefolk, risked quick glances toward her pew, toward the woman in red. The girl James Foster had once promised to marry under a dripping lilac tree. The one he had written to. The one he had kissed in a locked study. The one he had left. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She smiled. It wasn't real, but it was sharp. A shadow moved beside her. "You're either remarkably brave," said Luke Benjamin Carter, lowering himself into the empty seat beside her, "or remarkably bored. I haven't decided which." Caroline turned her head only slightly. "Hello, Luke." His brown hair was wind-tossed, his expression lazily amused, like a man who'd stumbled into a melodrama and decided to enjoy the wine. His eyes, clever and gold-flecked, watched her like she was the only interesting thing in a room full of fakes. "You know," he said casually, "most women try to ruin a wedding from the outside. You've taken a much bolder approach. Front row, scarlet silk, chin lifted like a guillotine blade. I am impressed." She looked back toward the altar. James and Margaret were turning now, arm in arm, glowing like false saints. "I came to wish him well," Caroline murmured. Luke gave a dry, incredulous sound. "Did you really?" "I meant it ironically," she added. That feels more honest." The newlyweds began their slow walk down the aisle, the organ swelling behind them like a sigh. James passed within 3 feet of her. He didn't look at her, not once. Luke leaned in close, voice lower now, like a secret tucked into a sleeve. "So what happens next?" Caroline rose slowly, the red fabric of her gown whispering against the polished wood. She adjusted her gloves, smoothed a non-existent wrinkle, and turned her gaze toward the heavy chapel doors swinging open on the spring wind. "Next," she said, "he remembers exactly what he threw away." Luke grinned, and then she smiled, not prettily, not sweetly. "Then," she said, "I take it all back and leave him with nothing." Margaret Foster invited her to tea. The response to Caroline's note arrived the next morning on pressed linen paper, delicately monogrammed and smelling faintly of violets. The tone was polite, the handwriting careful, and the message brief. "Miss Turner, I should be very glad to take tea with you. Tomorrow at 3. Yours cordially, Margaret Collins Foster." Caroline read it twice before setting it aflame in the fireplace. She smiled as it curled and blackened. The Collins residence, drawing room. 3 o'clock. It was the kind of sitting room designed to prove a point. Pale blues, embroidered cushions, books arranged by color and never touched. Margaret sat near the window, back straight, fingers resting lightly on a porcelain cup. She looked like a woman who'd never learned how to slouch or swear or scream. Caroline walked in wearing navy silk and a smile that could skin fruit. "Miss Turner," Margaret said, rising, "it's very kind of you to visit." "It is, isn't it?" They sat. Silence curled in the space between them, tight and thin as a ribbon. I was surprised to see you at the wedding, Margaret offered gently. James hadn't mentioned— No, Caroline interrupted smoothly. He wouldn't have. Margaret blinked. Just once. Tea was poured. Laps were smooth. The air tasted faintly of lavender and discomfort. I thought it would be good to speak, Caroline said, resting her elbow delicately on the armrest. We share an uncommon connection. Margaret looked down at her cup, not drinking. You and James were once close. Caroline tilted her head. We were. He used to write me letters every Tuesday. Not out of duty, out of longing. Do you know what that looks like, Mrs. Foster? Longing. Margaret's eyes flickered. You must forgive me, Caroline said brightly. I was under the impression that you married him for love. Was I mistaken? Margaret smiled tightly. We care for one another deeply. Care, Caroline echoed. Such a mild word. One uses it for houseplants and elderly aunts. Now Margaret drank her tea. You've made your point, she said, softly but firmly. Oh, I haven't made any points, Caroline said, leaning forward just enough to seem accidental. Not yet. Silence again. Margaret broke it. I think I understand now why he stopped mentioning you. Caroline laughed, a rich, unladylike sound. Darling, she said, he didn't stop mentioning me. He simply learned to lie more quietly. Margaret rose. This was a mistake. Was it? Caroline followed, her tone suddenly cool. Because I think it was an education. She turned to go, but paused near the doorway. He snores when he drinks brandy, she said without looking back. And he hates when you cry. He'll act concerned, but it makes him feel cornered. And he forgets birthdays. All of them. Even his own. Caroline glanced over her shoulder and smiled. Not warmly. Good luck, Mrs. Foster. Later that evening, Ashwood House Luke Carter was waiting in the library when Caroline returned, lounging like a cat who'd just knocked over a vase and wanted applause. You didn't, he said, without looking up from his book. Caroline peeled off her gloves, one finger at a time. I did. You took tea with the new Mrs. Foster. My God, did you use a butter knife or a scalpel? Caroline poured herself a brandy. Neither. I used the truth. She didn't like it. Luke watched her, something darker flickering behind the grin. You know what I admire about you, Turner? Only one thing. He stood and crossed the room, slow and deliberate. You walk into a perfectly polite world and remind it that polite women can still be dangerous. Caroline sipped. Is it your idea of flattery? No, this is. He leaned in, just enough, and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed her skin. Tell me when it stops being about him, Luke said, voice low, and starts being about you. Caroline didn't move, didn't blink, but something inside her shifted, a step closer to something she hadn't expected, and perhaps a step closer to power that no man, not even James Foster, would see coming. The reception was held in the garden behind Middleton Park's Great Hall, beneath silk canopies the color of cream, with enough crystal and lace to dress an empire. A quartet played something bright and dull all at once. Peacocks roamed freely near the hedge maze, indifferent to the guests who marveled at them as if they'd been summoned by aristocratic whim. Caroline stood at the edge of it all, a flute of champagne untouched in her gloved hand. Let them see me, she thought. Let them wonder why I came. The question flickered through every glance she caught. Why was she here? To those who didn't know the history, she was simply another Turner girl. The dark one, the clever one, the one who hadn't married yet and probably wouldn't. To those who did know, she was the one who James Foster had once called his future. Now she was just a guest in red. Margaret Collins, now Foster, was laughing with her mother near the rose trellis. The girl had a laugh like China. High, hollow, and breakable. Caroline watched her with clinical interest, as though trying to decide whether to pity her or poison her. She had not yet chosen. Stop staring at her like she's a piano you intend to drop from a balcony, Luke Carter said, suddenly beside her again. I wasn't staring. Darling, you were calculating. Caroline sipped her champagne without tasting it. Do you know what I regret? Luke smirked. Let me guess. The years you wasted waiting for a man who couldn't choose a woman who wore anything bolder than pearl. Her lips twitched, almost a smile. I regret, she said, not destroying him before he married her. A pause. You still could, Luke said, voice soft now. You do realize that, don't you? She turned to face him, finally. The wind lifted strands of her mid-brown hair, brushing them across her cheek. I intend to, she said. The champagne glass was abandoned on a tray. That evening, Ashwood House, the moment Caroline crossed the threshold of her family estate, the quiet struck her. Ashwood House had once been lively. Dinners, debates, a father who read Latin aloud, even when no one listened. Now it echoed. The drawing room waited with its soft decay, Persian rugs slightly dulled, the piano untouched for months. She tossed her gloves to a chair, unpinned her hair, and paced. On the writing desk by the tall window lay the box. Lacquered cherrywood. Untouched in half a year. Inside were the letters. From James. She opened it slowly, sifted through pages that smelled of ink and time and lies. His handwriting was always too neat, too careful, as though even on paper he couldn't bear to be messy. My dearest Caroline, I think of you every day, even when I shouldn't, especially when I shouldn't. The ache in her chest returned like a bruise pressed too hard. She reached for a fresh sheet of stationery, but she didn't write to James. She wrote to Margaret. Lady Margaret Foster, how strange to call you that now. You and I have never had the pleasure of a real conversation, which seems a shame. We're bound by something now, aren't we? A man, yes, but more than that, a history. I thought it might interest you to know that James once told me he found peonies vulgar, and yet you chose them for your wedding bouquet. You must forgive my tone. I'm sure you understand what it is to feel displaced. Shall we have tea? Caroline Turner, she folded the note neatly, sealed it with red wax, and gave it to the maid before she could change her mind. Let Margaret read it. Let her feel the breath of ghosts on her wedding night. Midnight Caroline lay awake beneath gauzy bed curtains, staring at the ceiling. She remembered the first time James had touched her wrist. How reverent it felt. How real. She remembered the first time he'd said, I'm yours, and the last time he'd said, I'm sorry. And now? Now he would remember her, not just as a girl he once loved, but as a shadow that would haunt his every perfection. He chose safety. She would become danger. The second night of James Everett Foster's marriage was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret had excused herself early with a headache. The fire in the drawing room hissed softly, unwatched. James remained in the leather chair by the hearth, his brandy forgotten in his hand, staring into nothing. Something was wrong. It wasn't Margaret's silence. He had expected a certain adjustment period. She was dutiful, gentle, cautious to a fault. No, it wasn't her voice that troubled him. It was Caroline's absence, or rather, her presence. She'd been at the wedding, in red, and then, as if summoned by some ancient curse, she'd visited his wife. He didn't know what had been said. Margaret wouldn't speak of it. She'd gone quiet the moment her maid announced Miss Turner had gone. Her fingers trembled when she poured tea that evening. She smiled too much. James had spent 2 years training himself not to think of Caroline Turner, not to think of her voice in the dark, her fingers ink-stained from the notes she wrote him, not to think of the way she looked at him, not like he was noble or brilliant or desirable, but like he was hers, and she was already deciding how best to ruin him for anyone else. It hadn't been a clean ending. There had been no ending at all, only silence. And then she arrived at his wedding. Red, a color that said, You thought I was gone? Darling, I've only just begun. You should have left the room. You should have called for Margaret. Instead, he poured another brandy. That same evening, Ashwood House. Caroline stood before the long mirror in her bedroom, still fully dressed. The navy silk clung to her waist like a secret. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, her eyes unreadable. She looked composed, perfectly arranged, as always, but she felt wild. She hadn't expected to enjoy the tea with Margaret. She hadn't expected pity to crawl into her thoughts. Not pity for Margaret, but for herself. A kind of bitter self-recognition. That girl by the window, all lace and grace, had no idea what it felt like to be unchosen. But I do, Caroline thought. A knock on the door. She didn't move. Another knock. Firmer. She opened it, and there stood Luke Carter, collar open, cravat loosened, rain on his shoulders. He smelled like wind and trouble. "I brought you this," he said, holding up a single letter in a wax-sealed envelope. "Delivered to me by accident, from someone who doesn't know how quickly Ashwood turns gossip into gospel." She took it. A single glance at the handwriting confirmed it. "James." She didn't open it. Luke watched her with something between amusement and concern. "You're playing a dangerous game, Turner." She turned the envelope over in her hand. "So are they. You could stop." She looked at him. "Could you?" Their eyes locked. No one spoke. No one moved. Then Caroline said, voice barely audible, "Do you ever wonder if you're the villain in someone else's love story?" Luke smiled slowly. "I hope I am." A pause. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, not quite a question. He hesitated, not out of shyness, but calculation. And then, to her surprise, he shook his head. "No," he said, "not yet." And just like that, he left her standing in the doorway, letter in hand, the taste of something unspoken lingering in the room like perfume. Midnight, Caroline's room. She opened the letter with a blade. Inside, James had written, "Caroline, I don't know what you want from this. I don't know why you came. But I know you, and I know what silence from you means. It means I should be afraid. Please, let this be the end. James." Caroline read it twice. Then she smiled and set it in the flame. The second night of James Everett Foster's marriage was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret had excused herself early with a headache. The fire in the drawing room hissed softly, unwatched. James remained in the leather chair by the hearth, his brandy forgotten in his hand, staring into nothing. Something was wrong. It wasn't Margaret's silence. He had expected a certain adjustment period. She was dutiful, gentle, cautious to a fault. No, it wasn't her voice that troubled him. It was Caroline's absence, or rather, her presence. She'd been at the wedding, in red, and then, as if summoned by some ancient curse, she'd visited his wife. He didn't know what had been said. Margaret wouldn't speak of it. She'd gone quiet the moment her maid announced Miss Turner had gone. Her fingers trembled when she poured tea that evening. She smiled too much. James had spent 2 years training himself not to think of Caroline Turner. James hadn't touched Margaret in 3 days. Not since the tea. He told himself it was exhaustion. Travel, ceremony, expectation. But when he closed his eyes at night, he didn't see the delicate curve of his wife's shoulder. He saw Caroline in red, watching him from the fourth pew like a judgment, like prophecy. And Margaret had changed. Nothing dramatic, just small things. She flinched when he said her name. She wore her hair differently, and she didn't ask about the letters. But he knew she knew. At dinner, she spoke gently of flowers and music, and he watched her mouth move and thought about the way Caroline used to bite the inside of her cheek when she was holding back something cruel. "James," Margaret said, "are you listening?" He blinked. "Of course." She hesitated. "She came here, you know. A beat." "I know," he said. "You told me." No, Margaret's voice wavered. "I mean, she was here. Not just visiting. She filled the room. The way she speaks, the things she said." James stared at his wineglass. Margaret's hand trembled faintly against the linen napkin. "She knows you. Better than I do." "No," he said too quickly. Then quieter. "She just plays games." Margaret nodded slowly. "She's winning, then." Ashwood House, drawing room. Luke Carter found Caroline in the drawing room, standing barefoot on the edge of the rug, staring at the rain beating the tall windows. "You're haunting him," Luke said. Caroline didn't turn. "Good. He sent you a letter. You burned it. I wasn't interested in apologies." Luke stepped closer. "That's not why he wrote." "Of course it is." No, Luke's voice dropped, roughened. "He wrote because he's unraveling. Because he wants something back, and he doesn't even know what it is anymore." Caroline looked at him then, really looked. "Does that scare you, Luke?" she asked. "That I know how to come apart and still remain standing?" "It doesn't scare me," he said, "but it might scare you." She blinked. Something in that landed too close to truth. Luke circled her slowly, the way one might approach a lioness whose hunger was not entirely predictable. "You loved him," he said softly. "You still do." "No. Liar." She stepped back, only slightly. Her voice chilled. "You're here because you like watching the match burn, Carter. Don't pretend it's anything more." He moved in, suddenly close. The storm outside cracked against the windows, thunder rolling low across the sky. Luke's voice was a murmur now, a dare. "You ever wonder," he said, "if you're setting fire to him or to yourself?" Caroline swallowed. "Just once. Maybe both," she whispered. And then she left him standing there, alone with the storm, while upstairs she closed her bedroom door and leaned against it, shaking. The next day, AC planted. Margaret received a package at noon. Inside was a book. Byron. Pages worn, cover cracked, with a letter folded inside. Not signed, not addressed. Just one sentence, in handwriting she didn't recognize. Ask him where he was the night of August 17th. That was the night James had disappeared for hours, claiming carriage trouble. The night he returned with his coat unbuttoned and his eyes wild. Margaret folded the note slowly, hands cold. And somewhere down the road at Ashwood, Caroline sat beneath a sycamore tree, reading a different letter, one that she'd written long ago, that James had never returned. Her fingers traced the ink like a prayer. And for the first time, she wondered if she was still playing a game, or if the game was starting to play her. The silence between James and Margaret was no longer a pause. It had become a presence, something that filled the house with the sound of things not being said. She still smiled at him at breakfast. He still kissed her temple before riding to the estate office. But their eyes never met for long, and she had not asked the question in the letter. Not yet, but she carried it around like a shard of glass tucked beneath her tongue. Ask him where he was the night of August 17th. That night, that damn night, she'd waited in her bed for him, a week before the engagement was made public. And he had come home looking like he'd seen a ghost. No explanation, just a quick lie and a cold kiss. Now, she wondered if the ghost had a name. In red silk. Ashwood House, Caroline's room. Caroline stood at her mirror with her corset half-laced and her hair falling in waves over her shoulders. Her hands were trembling. She hated that. The letters. The silence. The look on Margaret's face at tea. All of it had gone exactly to plan. And yet, she felt like she was chasing something. Or someone. She remembered the way James had once looked at her. Not with worship, but with terror. As if he knew she could undo him completely and still kiss him through the wreckage. She had loved that. She might still. The thought made her sick. A knock. She didn't answer. Luke walked in anyway. "Modesty," he said, glancing at the corset, "has officially died in this house." She grabbed her robe, glaring. He didn't flinch. "You're spiraling, Turner." "I'm winning." He stepped closer, voice low. "Then why do you look like you're about to break?" She didn't speak. Couldn't. Luke's expression shifted. Something feral softened into something real. "You've made him suffer," he said. "You've made her suffer, but you haven't made peace with any of it. You've burned down every room you were ever loved in, and now you're standing in the ashes, wondering why no one's coming to rescue you." She slapped him. It wasn't theatrical. It was real. The sound cracked the room. They stared at each other in silence. And then Luke, slow as a storm, took her face in his hands. Not roughly, not sweetly, with the weight of someone who knew what fury cost. "If you want to destroy him," he whispered, "I'll help you." Caroline's breath caught. "But if you want to survive this," Luke said, "you're going to have to decide if you're the villain in his story or the one who walks out of it." Her eyes burned. "No te has. Not yet. Just fire." Then she said, "He's going to lose everything." Luke nodded once. "So are you." That night, the Foster's bedroom. Margaret waited until James had set his book down. Then, softly, "Where were you the night of August 17th? He froze. She knew instantly. Not the details, but the weight of them. "Margaret, you lied to me." He stood. "It wasn't what you think. You were with her." A breath. "Yes." Margaret closed her eyes. He stepped forward, not with affection, but desperation. "It was before I proposed to you. I was trying to end it. But she never let me go. She didn't chain you to her carriage, James." Her voice broke. "You went." Silence. "You've never really chosen me, have you?" He tried to speak, but she had already turned away. And he felt it then, the quiet fracture, the beginning of the end. Ashwood, the mirror again. Caroline pressed her forehead to the glass. Her reflection looked back, pale and savage. She'd done it. She was inside their marriage now. A wedge, a crack, a ghost in the bed. But she didn't feel victorious. She felt hollow. She thought of Luke, of his hands on her face, of the way he said her name like it mattered. And then, damn her heart, she thought of James. The way he used to whisper her poems in the dark. The way he had once looked at her and said, "You ruin everything, Caroline Turner. Even the air." She whispered to her own reflection. "Then I suppose I'll ruin the ending, too." The storm had broken again. Ashwood was drenched in moonlight and rain, the sky rumbling low like a threat. Caroline stood on the balcony in a silk robe, wet at the hem, her hair unbound, her eyes on the tree-line where the shadows swallowed the night. She had been waiting for something, or someone. She wasn't sure which. Behind her, the door opened. Luke Carter stepped into the room with no announcement, no apology, only the calm presence of a man who made himself welcome in dangerous places. She didn't turn. "You always sneak in like a ghost, or do I just make you reckless?" "You make me many things," he said quietly. He crossed the room. The doors to the balcony remained open. The wind whispered between them like a breath neither was willing to exhale. "You've been quiet," she said. "You've been watching the storm." "I like storms." Luke came closer. "Because they break things?" "No." Her voice was almost gentle. "Because they cleanse them." He stood behind her now, so close she could feel the heat of him. She didn't move. His fingers brushed her shoulder, only once, as though asking for permission with a touch instead of question. "You're unraveling," he murmured. "I'm evolving." Caroline, her name on his tongue, was not soft. It was worship stripped of purity. She turned, and there they were, inches apart, the air too full of things unsaid. He lifted a hand, slid his fingers through the ends of her damp hair. "You don't want me," he said. She tilted her head. "Don't tell me what I want. You want control. You want someone to hurt. You want something to shatter." Her lips parted, but no protest came. Luke leaned closer. "And if I let you use me?" She swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" He took her wrist, gently, reverently, and lifted her hand to his chest, holding it there. "You can ruin me, Caroline, if that's what you need. If it'll keep you from setting yourself on fire." Her breath caught. "But don't pretend this would be love," he whispered. "Because I've seen how you love. And it's brutal." They stood like that, heart to heart, flame to flame, until the tension between them went taut, a live wire between desire and danger. Then she kissed him. Not softly. She kissed him like someone stealing something. From him, from herself, from the past she couldn't outrun. It was teeth and breath and fury. And he took it, matched it, gave back heat with heat. They staggered inside, colliding with the edge of the desk, the wall, the mirror. Her robe slipped. His hands didn't tremble. But then, suddenly she stopped. One hand on his chest, firm. Her lips parted. Her breath came fast. But her eyes were sharp again. "No," she said. "Not yet." Luke didn't push. He stepped back, breathing hard, watching her like he would watch a blade being drawn. Slow, deliberate, beautiful. "I'm not a mistake you can make twice," he said. She looked at him with something between regret and power. "Then be the one I make once, and remember forever." He laughed softly, not cruelly, not even bitterly, just real. And he left. She stood alone, robe hanging loose, the taste of him still on her lips, her heart a hammer in her chest. She hadn't meant for it to feel like that. She hadn't meant to feel anything. Meanwhile, the Fosters' estate. James sat in the study, staring at the empty fireplace. Margaret hadn't come down for dinner. He hadn't gone up to ask. The letter he'd written to Caroline, the one she hadn't replied to, sat folded in his pocket, a ghost he carried too close to his skin. He closed his eyes and saw her in red. He opened them again and wondered what it would take to get her back. The rain hadn't stopped all evening. It fell in slow sheets against the windows of Ashwood House, soft and endless. Caroline sat alone in the drawing room, barefoot in a high-backed chair, her hair loose down her back. A single candle flickered near her elbow, casting gold over glass and shadows. Her robe was still open at the throat from earlier, from Luke, but her body had gone cold. She wasn't shaking. She was just still, like a hunter after the arrow has flown, like a woman waiting for the knock that always comes. It came. Not a tap, a fist. 3 sharp pounds at the front door. Her heart stopped. She didn't move right away. She knew who it was. Somehow, she'd always known this night would come. The door. She opened it without asking. And there he was. James Everett Foster. Soaked through. Cravat gone. Jaw tight. Hair wild. His chest rose and felt like he'd run the whole way from Middleton. "Don't speak," he said, before she could even draw breath. She didn't. He stepped inside, dripping, burning. The door slammed behind him. "You sent her a letter," he said. "A book. A date." Caroline looked at him, really looked, and then, quietly, "Did she ask you where you were?" He froze. "Yes." "And what did you say?" "I told the truth." Caroline moved past him toward the hearth. Her voice was dry, cruel. That must have been exhausting. James's hands curled at his sides. "You don't get to judge me." "Don't I?" She turned. "You made promises. You wrote me things I couldn't forget if I tried. You made me believe in you." "You were the one who said no," he snapped. "You told me to leave." "I told you to choose," she shouted. A beat. The candle guttered. Silence surged between them, tidal, suffocating. Caroline's breath was uneven. "You chose safety. You chose her." "I chose a future I could survive," he said, quieter now. "You would have devoured me." She took a slow step toward him. "You say that like I didn't want to." Their eyes met. Too much there. Too much memory. Too much ruin. "You broke me," she whispered. "And I let you." James's voice dropped to a rasp. "I think you wanted me to." Another step. Another breath. They were close now. Inches. "You think I haven't dreamed of this?" he asked. "You. Me. Alone again. One last time." Caroline's fingers hovered near his jaw. "Then why did you marry her?" He looked at her like it hurt. "Because you didn't stop me." And she did something dangerous. She touched his mouth. Lightly. Slowly. Like a woman mapping out the exact line between memory and mistake. He kissed her. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was 6 months of silence, of hunger, of rage and regret, and every word unsaid. She kissed him back, once hard, fast, like she needed to prove she could still ruin him. And then she pulled away. "Get out." His eyes were glass. "Caroline, get out." He stared at her, disoriented, breathless, undone. And then he left. The hallway. Luke was standing at the end of it, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't interrupted. He had simply watched. Caroline met his gaze. Neither spoke. As she walked past him, slowly, chin high, barefoot and burning. He didn't follow. That night, alone again, Caroline lay in bed staring at the ceiling, still tasting James on her lips. And for the first time, she didn't feel powerful. She felt haunted. Not by him, by the version of herself that had once believed he could save her. The Foster's estate, Margaret. She had stopped crying hours ago. The silence of the morning wasn't peaceful. It was surgical. Margaret sat at her vanity, hairbrush frozen in her hand, as the maid delivered the envelope with trembling fingers. Not sealed, not signed, just placed. Inside was a pressed rose petal, a ribbon, and a line from a letter she'd once found in James's study, one he had sworn he had burned. "I hope you never love someone the way I loved you, because it ruins everything else forever." She didn't scream. She dressed in gray silk. She tied her hair herself. She walked into the garden with the poise of someone going to execution or delivering one. James was on the terrace, hands in his coat pockets, trying to look casual. He failed. "You went to her," Margaret said softly. He turned, slowly, eyes bloodshot, face hollow. "I had to." "No," she said. "You wanted to." He said nothing. "I would have forgiven you," she said, "if you had just made me feel chosen." James opened his mouth, but Margaret stepped back. "It doesn't matter anymore." "Margaret, I don't want to fight for someone who wants to be haunted." She walked away before he could stop her. She didn't cry. Not because she wasn't broken, but because broken things can still walk upright if they want to be seen. Ashwood House, afternoon. Caroline didn't sleep. She stood in the library, still wearing last night's robe, tracing the spines of books she hadn't touched in years. Her eyes were distant, and her heart felt like a bruise. She had kissed James. Push him out. And now the silence that followed felt different. Heavier. The door opened behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Luke. "Is this the part where you say I told you so?" she said. "No," Luke replied, voice quieter than usual. "This is the part where I ask if it was worth it." She turned. He looked tired. Not angry. Not smug. Just disappointed. That hurt more. Caroline tried to meet his gaze, but it felt like staring at something reflective. Not because he was judging her, but because he saw everything. "I needed to know what I was," she said. Luke stepped closer. "And what did he make you feel?" "Like I still loved him." Her voice broke on it. Luke's jaw flexed. "Do you?" No, a pause. "But I remember how it felt." Silence. Then, with a whisper of bitter humor, "He still kisses like he's trying to bury an apology in your mouth." Luke winced like she'd hit him. He sat in the armchair, elbows on knees, watching her. "You're not in love with him," he said. "But you're not in love with yourself either. Not the way you used to be." That stopped her cold. "I thought revenge would make me whole," she said softly. "Revenge doesn't complete you," Luke murmured. "It empties the part that wanted more." Caroline sat on the edge of the desk, robe slipping down one shoulder. Her voice was barely a breath. "What if this is all I am now?" Luke stood, crossed the room, took her chin between his fingers. "You're a hurricane wearing perfume," he said. "But storms aren't meant to stay in one place." Their faces were close again. Familiar. Frightening. She wanted him to kiss her. He didn't. Not yet. Instead, he said, "You've broken the story, Caroline. Now you get to write the ending." And he left her there, trembling, not from cold, but from the unbearable truth of it. The Fosters' estate, that evening. James stood in the center of his study, alone. The books were untouched. The brandy was full. The wedding portrait was gone, and he didn't know if he had lost Caroline or if she had finally lost him. The Fosters' estate, Margaret. She had stopped crying hours ago. The silence of the morning wasn't peaceful. It was surgical. Margaret sat at her vanity, hairbrush frozen in her hand, as the maid delivered the envelope with trembling fingers. Not sealed, not signed, just placed. Inside was a pressed rose petal, a ribbon, and a line from a letter she'd once found in James's study, one he had sworn he had burned. "I hope you never love someone the way I loved you, because it ruins everything else forever." She didn't scream. She dressed in gray silk. She tied her hair herself. She walked into the garden with the poise of someone going to execution, or delivering one. James was on the terrace, hands in his coat pockets, trying to look casual. He failed. "You went to her," Margaret said softly. He turned, slowly, eyes bloodshot, face hollow. "I had to." "No," she said. "You wanted to." He said nothing. "I would have forgiven you," she said, "if you had just made me feel chosen." James opened his mouth, but Margaret stepped back. "It doesn't matter anymore." "Margaret, I don't want to fight for someone who wants to be haunted." She walked away before he could stop her. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't broken, but because broken things can still walk upright if they want to be seen. Ashwood House, afternoon. Caroline didn't sleep. She stood in the library, still wearing last night's robe, tracing the spines of books she hadn't touched in years. Her eyes were distant, and her heart felt like a bruise. She had kissed James. Push him out. And now the silence that followed felt different. Heavier. The door opened behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Luke. "Is this the part where you say I told you so?" she said. "No," Luke replied, voice quieter than usual. "This is the part where I ask if it was worth it." She turned. He looked tired. Not angry. Not smug. Just disappointed. That hurt more. Caroline tried to meet his gaze, but it felt like staring at something reflective. Not because he was judging her, but because he saw everything. "I needed to know what I was," she said. Luke stepped closer. "And what did he make you feel?" "Like I still loved him." Her voice broke on it. Luke's jaw flexed. "Do you?" No, a pause. "But I remember how it felt." Silence. Then, with a whisper of bitter humor, "He still kisses like he's trying to bury an apology in your mouth." Luke winced like she'd hit him. He sat in the armchair, elbows on knees, watching her. "You're not in love with him," he said. "But you're not in love with yourself either. Not the way you used to be." That stopped her cold. I thought revenge would make me whole, she said softly. Revenge doesn't complete you, Luke murmured. It empties the part that wanted more. Caroline sat on the edge of the desk, robe slipping down one shoulder. Her voice was barely a breath. What if this is all I am now? Luke stood, crossed the room, took her chin between his fingers. You're a hurricane wearing perfume, he said. But storms aren't meant to stay in one place. Their faces were close again. Familiar. Frightening. She wanted him to kiss her. He didn't. Not yet. Instead, he said, You've broken the story, Caroline. Now you get to write the ending. And he left her there, trembling, not from cold, but from the unbearable truth of it. The invitation arrived by hand. No seed, no return name, just an address. A time, a single line, written in the same clean script as Margaret's wedding vows. If you truly want to end this, meet me where the garden dies. Caroline turned the card over once, twice, eyes narrowing. She hadn't heard a word from Margaret since the collapse. She expected fury, silence. She did not expect this. The old glass house, Collins Estate. The garden behind the Collins Estate had once been famous for its summer blooms. Now it was brittle underfoot, the soil damp with autumn's refusal to die quietly. At the edge of it sat the old glass house, long disused, its frames speckled with moss, its windows stained with rain and time. Caroline stepped inside. Margaret was already there, but not in white, not in lace. She wore black wool, her hair pinned high, her back to the door. I wondered if you'd come, she said. I nearly didn't, Caroline replied. But then I realized I was curious what it looks like when porcelain shatters. Margaret turned, and she was smiling. Not madly, not weakly. It was a smile Caroline knew, because she'd warned herself. The kind you use when the pain has turned into something sharper. Purpose. You think you won, Caroline, Margaret said calmly. You think I was just the collateral damage in your revenge opera. Caroline raised a brow. Wasn't that what you signed up for? A quiet life. A quiet man. I signed up for a man I thought I could build a future with, until I realized his past was louder than my voice. Caroline stepped forward. So this is what? A warning? I lecture. Margaret shook her head. No, it's an offer. That stopped her. An offer? Margaret smiled wider. You broke James. You burned him. And I could spend the next year trying to claw back dignity and whispers and whatever scraps of reputation remain. She walked closer. Her heels were silent on the damp stone. But I'd rather build something. Caroline studied her. You want to align? Margaret nodded. You and I, we're not that different. I kissed your husband. You ruined my husband, Margaret corrected. That's worse. And oddly, I admire it. A beat. Then, imagine what we could do together. Caroline's mouth parted. She wasn't breathing properly. Do what? Margaret tilted her head. Take the whole thing down. Not just James. Not just one man. The system. The ballrooms. The breeding. The cages sewn into our bodices. The way we're taught to wait and be chosen. Caroline stepped back. You want a revolution. I want a legacy. Silence. The air in the glass house pressed against the windows, as if listening. Margaret reached into her pocket, pulled out a list. Names. Dates. Secrets. The kind you gather when you're quiet. Overlooked. Trusted. I have information, she said. You have strategy. Caroline stared at the names. Dukes. Barons. Widows. Scandals sealed behind velvet curtains. We make them remember us, Margaret whispered. Not as ghosts, but as gods. That evening, Ashwood House. Luke waited by the fire. Caroline returned with wind in her hair and rain on her lips. He looked up, sensing the shift. What did she say? He asked. Caroline poured herself a drink, then turned to him with the calm of a woman who had just stopped being angry and started being dangerous. She said she wants to help me burn the world. Luke stared at her, and then he smiled. You're going to say yes. I already did. The plan was simple. The execution would be art. Caroline and Margaret didn't meet again in parlors or over tea. They met in silence, in coded letters, in midnight carriages, in the space between what society could see and what it refused to believe. Their first target, Lord Edmund Whitehall, a respected viscount, a benefactor to orphanages, A man who had once, quite privately, offered Caroline a position as a companion, if she agreed to keep his evenings warm. She had laughed in his face. He had retaliated in whispers. But Margaret had the letters. She always did. The ball at Harrow's End. They didn't arrive together. Of course not. Caroline wore black this time. Not mourning. Not quite. A black silk gown with sharp lines and a slit just high enough to make the most boring men forget their drinks. Her hair was coiled like a crown, her gloves white. Margaret arrived 15 minutes later. In cream. Innocent. Boring. Forgettable. They danced with no one. They drank just enough. And then, they let the rumor loose. Did you hear what Lord Whitehall did in Vienna? No. Not to her brother. They say he pays the papers not to print things. The girl? Barely 15. They didn't lie. They just told the truth no one else had dared say. And within an hour, Lord Whitehall had excused himself from the ballroom, pale and shaking. Within a day, he had fled London. The next morning, Ashwood House. Caroline awoke to a room filled with flowers. No note, just peonies. She laughed, loudly, freely, cruelly. Whitehall had once told her peonies were vulgar. She plucked one from the arrangement, crushed it in her fist, and dropped the petals on the floor. The door opened behind her. Luke. He looked different this morning. Tired. Tense. His cravat askew, his sleeves still damp from riding hard through rain. You started it, he said quietly. Caroline turned, unbothered. We did. Whitehall's running. Society's buzzing. You're everywhere. I'm finally visible. Luke didn't smile. He stepped forward. And then he said something she wasn't expecting. You're being watched. Caroline blinked. By who? Luke pulled a folded note from his coat and handed it to her. No seal. No signature. Inside was a name. Margaret Collins Foster. And beneath it a line. She's not who you think she is. That night, Caroline alone. She sat in the library, the fire low, the shadows tall. The letter lay open beside her, mocking her calm. Could Luke be lying? No, not him. Not like this. Could Margaret? Of course. And that was what made this so thrilling. Because now she wasn't sure who was using whom. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't care. She poured herself another drink. She would meet with Margaret again tomorrow. And this time, she wouldn't just be wearing silk and secrets. She'd be wearing armor. Because the most dangerous alliances are the ones that believe they're on the same side. It was the anniversary of the wedding. Not her wedding, of course. Theirs. James and Margaret, who were now neither together nor speaking, if the social columns were to be believed. Margaret had vanished in a continental society, and James? Well, James had been seen drinking more often than speaking. Caroline, however, was very visible, especially tonight. She wore red. Not just any red. The red. The one from that day, but altered. Lower at the back. Open at the throat. A declaration and a warning. The ballroom at Havenfell was full, champagne flowing, music spinning through the candlelight like scandal through society. Every eye turned when she entered. Not because she was alone, but because she wasn't. Luke Carter had his hand at her waist. He didn't wear his usual smirk. He wore something sharper. Pride and possession. They didn't dance immediately. They circulated. Her fingers at his arm, his gaze following the curve of her shoulder when she leaned too close to speak. People whispered. They always whispered. Is that Caroline Turner? With Carter? I thought he was dangerous. I heard she broke 3 families. I heard she made a viscount flee the country. Caroline just smiled. She didn't deny anything anymore. Luke pulled her into the shadows of the terrace, where the roses bloomed wild and the music blurred into velvet air. He pushed her gently against the marble wall, lips grazing her throat. Everyone in there thinks I'm your trophy, he murmured. You are, she said, fingers curling into his coat. But you're also my favorite sin. His laugh was low, dark, dangerous. And what are you, Caroline? She leaned in until her breath kissed his ear. I'm the story they warn their sons about. Then she kissed him, and it wasn't gentle. It was claiming. He lifted her by the waist, pressed her back into the stone, and her hands were already in his hair, her mouth parting like a door to something holy and wicked. When they pulled back, breathless, he whispered, we could leave. Tonight. Run the country. Burn the rest. She smiled. You think I want to run? He arched a brow. She leaned close, lips brushing his again. No, darling. I want to rule. They re-entered as if nothing had happened. And yet, everything had. Her lipstick slightly smudged. His cravat missing. Eyes followed them. Mouths whispered. Power shifted. Caroline accepted a drink from a trembling waiter and turned to Luke, her voice like silk dragged across skin. Do you think they'll remember this night? He tilted his head. No, they'll remember you. She laughed, low and real and wicked, and the candlelight danced across her smile.